The first thing they told me when I started monitoring floodgates in Arkansas was simple. If a gate moves, it's because someone made it move. That's how the system stays predictable. That's how people downstream stay alive. The second thing they told me was never written down. If a gate opens without a command, you log it, but you don't touch it. I thought it was one of those things people say on night shift to see if you'll repeat it back, like it means something. Then, at 1:58 a.m., one of the upstream gates opened on its own, and the water level downstream dropped before it should have. The first thing they told me when I started monitoring floodgates in Arkansas was simple. If a gate moves, it's because someone made it move. That's how the system stays predictable. That's how people downstream stay alive. The second thing they told me was never written down. If a gate opens without a command, you log it, but you don't touch it. I thought it was one of those things people say on night shift to see if you'll repeat it back, like it means something, like a habit that stuck around longer than the reason for it. The station itself didn't feel like the kind of place where anything could move on its own. Everything was mechanical, visible, and slow enough that you could track it without guessing. Then, at 1:58 a.m., one of the upstream gates opened on its own, and the water level downstream dropped before it should have. The control station sat on a raised concrete platform about 30 yards back from the spillway, high enough that you could see the entire line of gates if you stepped outside and leaned on the rail. There were 8 of them, spaced evenly across the channel, each one a steel slab that lifted straight up when you sent the command through the panel. During the day, you could hear trucks crossing the service road behind the tree line, but at night it dropped off into something quieter, more isolated, just the steady pressure of water moving through a controlled space and the hum from the lights mounted along the structure. Inside, the room was small and practical. One desk bolted to the floor, one control panel mounted waist high, and one terminal for logging. No extra equipment, no redundancy systems, nothing that would complicate responsibility. The panel worked the way you expected it to if you had ever dealt with municipal systems before. Each gate had its own switch, labeled clearly, with a position indicator that tracked movement in measured increments instead of vague markers. You didn't guess where a gate was. You saw it in numbers. When you moved a switch, you held it until the indicator reached the point you wanted, then released it, and the system locked that position in place. Every action required a confirmation input on the terminal beside it, and once you confirmed it, the log recorded everything automatically. Operator ID, exact timestamp, gate number, direction of movement, and how far it had been adjusted. There was no way to move a gate without leaving a record unless you physically broke something, and if that happened, alarms would trigger immediately. That structure was the reason I took the job in the first place. At my last position, I had signed off on a pressure irregularity in a municipal water system that I should have flagged for a full shutdown. It wasn't a dramatic failure, nothing that made the news outside the county, but it was enough to push water into places it wasn't supposed to go, and damage a line of homes that didn't have the kind of insurance that covers something like that cleanly. No one got hurt, but the paperwork didn't protect me the way I thought it would. The report said the system had stabilized. The aftermath proved it hadn't. After that, I wasn't interested in working anywhere that relied on interpretation or assumptions. I wanted something where the system either matched reality or it didn't. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ran through until just after sunrise, when the day operator came in and took over. Nights were supposed to be quiet, unless there was weather pushing water levels up, and even then, most adjustments were gradual and planned ahead of time. The first 2 nights I worked, nothing happened that required more than routine checks. I logged levels every 30 minutes, verified that each gate matched its recorded position, and stayed ahead of the kind of small changes that could turn into larger ones if ignored. The supervisor had walked me through the process once, and didn't spend much time on anything beyond that. As long as the logs were clean and the numbers stayed within range, the assumption was that you were doing the job correctly. On my 3rd night, the pattern held until just before 2 a.m. I was sitting at the desk, halfway through logging a routine level check, when I heard the shift in the sound outside. It wasn't loud enough to stand out immediately, just a slight change in how the water moved through the channel, like the pressure had redistributed somewhere upstream. I finished entering the numbers before looking up at the panel, mostly out of habit, and that was when I saw that Gate 6 was no longer sitting at 0. The indicator showed it had opened slightly, not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to change flow. I hadn't touched the switch. I hadn't even been standing near it. My first thought was that I had missed something. Maybe I had brushed the switch without realizing it, or maybe there had been a scheduled adjustment I hadn't seen in the handoff notes. I checked the panel again, then the terminal. The movement was there in the log. Gate 6 opened by a small increment at 1:58 a.m., recorded cleanly with the correct format and timing. Everything about the entry looked normal, except for one thing. The field that listed the operator ID was blank, not incorrect, not overwritten, just empty in a way that didn't match the rest of the system. Every other entry before it had a name attached. Mine, from earlier in the shift, were all there and matched my login. This one didn't. I sat there for a minute longer than I should have, looking at the entry like it would correct itself if I gave it enough time. Systems like that didn't leave gaps unless something had gone wrong in the input process, and even then, they usually flagged it. There was no flag, no alert, no warning, nothing that suggested the system recognized a problem. The only thing that indicated anything was off was that empty space where a name should have been. I checked the downstream level reading next, mostly because that was the part that actually mattered in terms of consequences. The number had dropped slightly, not by much, but enough that it didn't match the expected timing for that kind of change. That was when the second part of what I had been told came back to me, the part that hadn't been written down anywhere official. If a gate opens without a command, you log it, but you don't touch it. I didn't like the idea of leaving a system in a state I hadn't created, especially when I couldn't account for why it had changed in the first place. Everything in me leaned toward correcting it, closing the gate back to 0, and resetting the condition before it had a chance to drift further out of range. But the numbers weren't critical. The drop downstream wasn't dangerous. It was just early enough to feel wrong, not early enough to justify breaking procedure. So I did what the job expected me to do, even if I didn't like the reasoning behind it. I logged the discrepancy exactly as it appeared. Gate 6, movement recorded without operator ID, downstream level change, observed ahead of expected timing. I left the gate where it was and moved on to the next check cycle, telling myself I would bring it up in the morning when the supervisor came in. For the next 20 minutes, nothing else changed. The panel stayed steady, the numbers held, and the water outside settled back into the same slow pattern it had before. Then, at 2:21 a.m., another gate shifted. This time, I was looking directly at the panel when it happened, and I saw the indicator move without the switch being touched. I didn't move right away when the second gate shifted. I kept both hands flat on the edge of the desk and watched the indicator climb and settle like it had followed a clean input. Gate 4 this time, closer to the middle of the spillway, not upstream like the first one. The movement wasn't large, maybe a foot at most, but it was precise in a way that mattered. No hesitation, no uneven pull, no sign that anything mechanical had forced it. It lifted at a steady rate, stopped exactly where it should, and held there without drift. That's what made it harder to process. If it had jerked or stalled, I could have blamed the equipment. This looked intentional. I checked the switch again, slow this time, making sure I wasn't missing something obvious. It hadn't moved. It was still in the neutral position, aligned exactly where I had left it earlier in the shift, untouched. I stepped over to the terminal immediately, not giving myself time to think through explanations that didn't fit. The log was already updated by the time I pulled it up, like the system hadn't needed any delay to record what had just happened. Gate 4 opened at 2:21 a.m., formatted cleanly with the same structure as every other entry. The timestamp matched what I had just seen, down to the minute, and the movement range was consistent with the position indicator on the panel. There were no errors, no flags, nothing marked for review. The only thing missing was the operator ID. The field was empty again, not filled with a default value or a placeholder, just blank in a way that didn't match how the system handled incomplete inputs. I refreshed the screen twice, then pulled up the previous entry for Gate 6 to compare them side by side. Both entries matched in a way that made them feel connected instead of isolated. Same formatting, same absence of operator ID, same lack of any system-level response to something that should have triggered at least a warning. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I needed to, reading through the lines again, like repetition might reveal something I had missed the first time. It didn't, so I stepped outside, taking the metal door slow so it wouldn't slam behind me and break the quiet that had settled over the structure. The air felt heavier than it had earlier, thick with humidity that held onto the light from the fixtures instead of letting it spread. From the walkway, I could see Gate 4 clearly, the gap just wide enough for the water to push through with more force than the surrounding sections. Nothing about it looked wrong in a way that would stand out to someone passing by. If I had walked up to the site at that moment without knowing what I had just seen on the panel, I would have assumed that gate had been set hours earlier as part of a gradual adjustment. The flow pattern made sense visually. The water pushed through the opening, redistributed downstream, and continued along the channel without turbulence that would suggest a sudden change. That was the part that stayed with me when I went back inside. The system wasn't behaving like something had gone wrong. It was behaving like everything had been planned in advance. I checked the downstream level again before looking at anything else, watching the number settle into place on the display as it updated in real time. The level had dropped again, just slightly, but enough to confirm that the pattern hadn't stopped with the first movement. What didn't sit right was the timing. Based on the gate position and the rate of flow, the change shouldn't have shown up yet. Not this quickly, and not this cleanly. I pulled up the earlier data and compared the curve, lining up the timestamps to see exactly when the shift had started. It was the same as before. The level had begun to move before the gate had registered any change in position. Not by much, maybe a minute or two, but enough that the sequence didn't match the way the system was built to operate. That was when it stopped feeling like two separate issues and started feeling like something was working ahead of the inputs instead of reacting to them. I stayed at the panel longer than I needed to, not because there was anything left to check, but because I didn't trust the idea of stepping away from it. The system had already done two things I couldn't account for, and both of them had happened while I was within arm's reach of the controls. That mattered more than anything else. If something could move a gate without using the panel, it didn't need me to leave the room to do it again. I kept my hands off the switches, even though every part of the job training pushed you toward correcting irregularities as soon as you saw them. The numbers weren't critical. Everything was still within acceptable range. That was the only reason I could justify waiting. I opened a blank notepad file on the terminal and started logging the exact times myself, separate from the system record. I wrote down the time of the second movement and then went back to the first one, matching both entries against what the system had recorded. I didn't change anything in the official log. I just copied the information over so I could track it without relying on something that had already proven it could leave things out. Once I had both events written down, I added the downstream level readings next to them, lining them up so I could see the sequence clearly. It didn't improve anything. If anything, it made the pattern harder to ignore. Both times the level had shifted before the gate movement had been recorded. Not after, not during, but before, like the system had already adjusted to something that hadn't technically happened yet. At 2:34 a.m., I saw the next change coming before it registered. I was watching the downstream level readout when the number ticked down by a fraction, small enough that it could have been part of a gradual trend if I hadn't been looking for it. I checked the panel immediately after and saw that all 8 gates were still showing their previous positions. Nothing had moved yet. I waited, counting it out in my head without meaning to, just tracking seconds because there wasn't anything else to hold on to. 12 seconds later, Gate 2 lifted by a narrow increment, the indicator climbing and stopping in the same clean motion I had seen before. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even shift my weight. I just watched it happen in the exact order the system wasn't supposed to allow. I went straight to the terminal again, faster this time, already expecting what I was going to see, but still needing to confirm it. The entry was there, fully formed. Gate 2, opened at 2:34 a.m., correct timestamp, correct movement range, same clean formatting as the others. The operator ID field was empty again. No delay, no placeholder, no sign that the system recognized anything unusual about the missing input. I refreshed the log once, then again, not because I thought it would change, but because I needed to see if anything else would update around it. Nothing did. The entry stayed exactly the same, like it had been written that way from the start. I checked the downstream level one more time, comparing it against the timestamp, and the sequence held. That was the point where I stopped thinking in terms of isolated failures and started looking at the system as something that was maintaining its own consistency without my involvement. The gates weren't just moving on their own. They were moving in a way that kept everything within operational limits, like whatever was driving the changes understood exactly how much adjustment was needed and when to apply it. The logs didn't look broken. They looked incomplete in a very specific way, like they were recording the result but leaving out the cause. I stood there with my hands still off the panel, aware that the only thing I hadn't tried yet was interfering directly. The rule I had been given sat in the back of my mind, steady and specific. Log it, but don't touch it. I followed it again. I didn't touch the panel after the third movement, not because I trusted what was happening, but because I needed to see how much of the system still depended on me. Up to that point, every unscheduled adjustment had stayed small, clean, and operationally useful. Nothing had lurched out of range. Nothing had triggered an alarm. If someone walked in at the end of the shift and looked only at the water levels, they would have said the station had been monitored correctly. That part mattered more than I wanted it to. I kept comparing the gate positions on the panel to the handwritten times and level readings I had copied into my own notes, trying to find some sign of drift, delay, or correction that would make this feel mechanical instead of deliberate. There wasn't one. Everything held exactly where it should have, as if the system was being managed by something that understood the flow pattern well enough to stay invisible inside it. At 2:49 a.m., I leaned over the panel and studied Gate 5 without touching the switch. The downstream level had been trending in a direction that would normally call for a small correction there. Nothing dramatic, just enough to stabilize the drop and keep the curve from continuing any lower than necessary. That was the kind of choice the job trained into you after a few shifts. You learned to read the numbers and see the next adjustment before you made it. I put my hand over the switch and held it there, not resting on it, just close enough that I could move if I decided to. I was still thinking through whether to act when I stopped myself. The rule stayed in the back of my mind, steady and specific. Log it, but don't touch it. I pulled my hand back. 4 seconds later, Gate 5 opened by a narrow increment on its own. The movement matched what I had been about to do closely enough that I felt it before I accepted it. Same gate, same size adjustment, same timing, relative to the level trend I had been watching. It wasn't just plausible, it was the exact correction I would have made if I had gone through with it. I stayed still and watched the indicator finish its rise and hold in place, waiting for some sign that I had missed an earlier input or misunderstood the conditions. Nothing about it looked accidental. The switch itself remained in neutral, untouched, exactly where it had been when I drew my hand away. When I finally turned to the terminal, the entry was already there. Gate 5 opened at 2:49 a.m. Correct movement range, correct timestamp, blank operator IED. The structure of the record was clean enough that the missing name looked less like an error and more like an omission the system had chosen to leave in place. That was the first moment the problem changed shape for me. Until then, I had been treating the gate movements like unauthorized actions inside a closed system, something hidden but still mechanical, something that could eventually be traced back to a damaged component, a bad relay, or a control fault I hadn't found yet. But this was different. Gate 5 had not just moved before I acted. It had moved after I decided what I was about to do, and then chose not to do it. I went back through my notes and forced myself to compare the earlier events the same way. asking whether those adjustments had also lined up with the decisions I had been forming before the movements happened. The answer wasn't as sharp, but it was there. Each one had matched the next reasonable correction well enough that I might have made it myself if the system hadn't gotten there first. I stepped back from the panel after that and let a few feet of empty space sit between me and the controls. The room hadn't changed, but it no longer felt like a place where I was operating equipment. It felt like I was standing inside a process that had already accounted for me. The terminal hummed quietly to my left. The position lights on the panel stayed steady. Outside the window, the spillway looked the way it always had at night. Hard lines, fixed lights, black water moving through a structure built to reduce uncertainty. Nothing in the view suggested loss of control. In fact, that was what made it worse. The system was still doing the job correctly. Water levels remained safe. Gate positions remained useful. The only thing that had changed was that I could no longer tell whether I was monitoring the station or just watching it continue without me. I stayed back from the panel and let the system run without input for a while, long enough that it stopped feeling like I was about to step in and correct something. The downstream level held inside a narrow band, adjusting in small increments that didn't draw attention unless you were watching it continuously. I kept my eyes on the readout and waited to see if the pattern would repeat without me prompting it in any way. At 3:07 a.m., the number dipped again, not enough to trigger a concern, just enough to signal that a correction would normally follow. I didn't move. I didn't even shift my weight toward the panel. I just counted the seconds the way I had earlier. 10 seconds passed. 15. Then gate 3 lifted slightly, clean and precise, bringing the level back into a steady line like the adjustment had been scheduled in advance. This time, I went to the terminal before I looked at the panel, changing the order on purpose to see if anything would feel different. The entry was already there, sitting at the top of the log like it had been waiting for me to confirm it. Gate 3 opened at 3:07 a.m., formatted correctly, movement range accurate, operator ID blank. I didn't refresh the screen. I didn't need to. The pattern had settled into something consistent enough that I could predict the structure of the record before I saw it. What I hadn't expected was how normal it would start to feel after a few repetitions. The missing name stopped standing out as much as it had earlier. The timing stopped surprising me. What stayed wrong was the sequence, the way the level changed first and the gate followed, like it was catching up to a decision that had already been made. I pulled up the earlier entries again and compared them against the times I had written down manually, lining everything up so I could see the spacing between each movement. The intervals weren't random. They followed the flow conditions in a way that matched how I would have adjusted the gates if I had been actively managing them. Small corrections spaced far enough apart to avoid overcompensating, each one placed where it would stabilize the trend without reversing it. That part of it was almost routine. The only difference was that I wasn't the one making those decisions anymore. I looked at the panel again and tried to imagine stepping back in, taking control, overriding what had already been set. The thought didn't settle the way it should have. It felt like interruption instead of correction. At 3:18 a.m., I tested something without meaning to turn it into a test. I focused on gate 7, watching the upstream level instead of the downstream one this time, following the numbers as they moved toward a point where I would normally make a small adjustment. I didn't move my hands. I didn't lean toward the switch. I just held the idea in place long enough that it was clear in my head what I was expecting to do. The level shifted first, just slightly, then held. 5 seconds passed. 8. Gate 7 opened by a narrow increment, the indicator climbing to a position that matched the correction I had been thinking through. I hadn't acted. I hadn't even approached the panel. Still, the system had moved in the exact place I had been watching. I didn't go to the terminal right away after that one. I stayed where I was and looked at the panel instead, taking in all 8 indicators at once, like I needed to confirm that they were still tied to the same system I had been working with at the start of the night. Nothing looked out of place. The positions made sense relative to each other. The water levels stayed within range. If I ignored the timing and the missing operator IDs, it would have passed as a clean shift. That was what made it harder to respond. There was nothing failing that I could fix without making things worse. When I finally stepped over to the terminal, the entry was exactly what I expected it to be. Gate 7, 3:18 a.m. Correct range. No operator ID. I logged it again, exactly as it appeared. By 3:30 a.m., I had reached the point where staying inside the control room was giving me less information than it was costing me. I had watched enough unscheduled movements to know the pattern wasn't random, and enough level changes to know the sequence wasn't behaving the way the system had been built to behave. The only part I hadn't verified closely enough was the physical side of it. I had looked from the walkway, but that wasn't the same as checking the gates at structure level, where you could see the actual clearance, the rate of flow through the opening, and whether the metal was sitting where the panel claimed it was. I printed the latest discrepancy log, left it on the desk beside the keyboard, and grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door. Before I went out, I looked at the panel one more time. Gate 3, Gate 5, and Gate 7 were all holding the positions the system had assigned them. Nothing on the board suggested urgency. That almost kept me inside. The walkway down to the service path ran along the side of the platform and dropped toward the spillway in 2 concrete sections with metal railings that sweated under the night air. The closer I got to the water, the louder everything became. Not dramatic, just more defined. The controlled flow you barely noticed from inside the room separated into individual sounds, pressure through narrow gaps, vibration in the steel framing, water striking the lower channel and spreading into darker current beyond the light. Flood control sites always sound more active at night than they look. The structure holds still, but the water underneath it makes it seem like the whole place is working harder than the lights suggest. I kept the flashlight low and moved toward Gate 5 first because that was the one that had bothered me most. It hadn't just opened without input. It had opened with the exact correction I had been about to make myself. From the panel, Gate 5 had shown a narrow lift, just enough to alter the flow rate without drawing attention to itself. From ground level, it didn't look narrow at all. I stopped a few yards short and held the flashlight on the lower edge, following the line where the steel should have sat relative to the concrete markings cut into the side support. The opening was visibly wider than what I had seen on the board, not by some huge amount that turned it into a disaster, but enough that I knew I wasn't looking at the same position the control room was reporting. The water through that section was moving with more force than a small correction should have produced, and once I saw it, I couldn't talk myself out of it. I checked the side marker twice, then a third time, lining the beam up against the reference stripe the maintenance crews used during inspection. The gate was higher than the panel said it was. That should not have been possible in a system this simple. I stayed there longer than I needed to, mostly because I wanted the mismatch to shrink the longer I looked at it. It didn't. If anything, the gap became easier to read once my eyes adjusted and I stopped second-guessing the first impression. The panel had shown a controlled partial opening. The actual gate looked closer to a full operational correction, the kind of movement I would have expected during active water management, not the kind of barely noticeable shift that had been logged. I turned and checked the adjacent gates for comparison. Gate 4 looked close to what the panel had reported earlier. Gate 6 looked almost exact. Gate 5 was the one that was off, and it was off in a way that still kept the overall system stable. That was the detail that started working on me while I stood there. The mismatch didn't create failure. It created a more efficient result than the control room was willing to admit. When I headed back toward the platform, I was already running through explanations I didn't believe. A stuck indicator, a calibration problem, a reporting delay between the mechanical position and the panel readout. None of that fit cleanly with what I had just seen, because any fault large enough to misstate the gate height by that amount should have shown up somewhere else in the chain. The terminal should have flagged it. The panel should have drifted. The level pattern should have exposed it more obviously. Instead, the system had done the opposite. It had hidden the difference inside a set of safe numbers and clean-looking records. I stepped back into the control room with wet air still on my clothes and looked straight at Gate 5's indicator. It still showed the smaller position. Then I checked the downstream level again and felt my stomach tighten. The reading matched the wider opening I had just seen outside, not the narrower one on the board. I didn't go back outside right away. I stayed in the control room and forced myself to verify everything from the panel first, step by step, the way you would if you were trying to prove a system was still reliable. Gate 5's indicator hadn't moved since I walked back in. It still showed the smaller opening, the one that would have produced a gentler change in flow. The downstream level, though, held steady at a value that matched what I had seen at the gate itself, not what the panel claimed. That was the first time both readings stayed wrong at the same time, without correcting each other. I opened the historical graph on the terminal and overlaid the last 30 minutes. The curve looked clean, gradual, and controlled, but the rate of change aligned with the wider physical opening, not the recorded position. The system wasn't just misreporting one thing, it was maintaining a consistent picture that didn't match what was physically there. I pulled up the maintenance diagnostics next, even though I already knew what they were going to show. The system didn't have deep self-checks or automated calibration routines, just basic status indicators that confirmed whether components were responding to input commands. Every gate reported operational. No faults, no delays, no signal interruptions between the panel and the actuators. That was what made it worse. If something had been broken, I could have isolated it, documented it, and shut down the affected section until morning. Instead, everything claimed to be working within normal parameters while producing a result that didn't exist in a single place you could point to. I hovered over the manual override for Gate 5 for a few seconds, long enough to feel the weight of the decision. then pulled my hand back again. If I changed it now, I wouldn't know which version of the system I was correcting. At 3:42 a.m., another change came through, but this time it didn't start with a level shift I could track in advance. The panel registered it first. Gate 2's indicator dropped slightly, like the gate had lowered instead of lifting. That hadn't happened yet during the shift. Every previous movement had been an opening, a controlled increase in flow. This was the opposite. I watched the indicator settle and then immediately checked the downstream level, expecting to see the effect follow. It didn't, not right away. The number held steady for a few seconds longer than it should have, then began to rise in a way that matched the reduction in flow. The sequence had flipped. The panel moved first, the water followed, but the timing still didn't sit cleanly. It felt staged, like the system was choosing which part of the process to show me first. I went back outside again, faster this time, not bothering to grab the printed log or take another look at the terminal before I left. Gate 2 sat lower than it had before, but not by the amount the panel suggested. I ran the flashlight along the edge, checking the clearance against the same concrete markings I had used earlier. The difference was smaller than what I had seen at Gate 5, but it was still there. The physical position didn't match the reported one. I moved along the spillway and checked Gate 3 next, then Gate 7. Both of them showed minor discrepancies as well, not enough to stand out individually, but enough that I couldn't ignore the pattern once I saw it repeated. The system wasn't misreading a single gate anymore. It was presenting a consistent version of all of them that only existed inside the control room. When I came back inside, I didn't go straight to the panel. I stopped in the doorway and looked at the room as a whole, like stepping back might make the connections easier to see. The terminal, the panel, the readings, all of it still aligned with each other perfectly. If I had never walked down to the gates, there would have been nothing in here to suggest anything was wrong. That was the part that settled in harder than the rest. The system wasn't failing. It was maintaining a version of reality that stayed internally consistent no matter what the physical structure was doing outside. I stepped over to the terminal and opened the latest entries again, reading through them slowly. Every movement was there. Every timestamp was clean. The operator ID fields were still blank. And now, for the first time, some of the logged positions matched neither what I had seen on the panel nor what I had seen at the gates. I didn't sit down right away after reading the last set of entries. I stayed standing over the terminal, scrolling back through the log one line at a time, slower than I needed to, making sure I wasn't missing something because I was moving too fast. Up to that point, every unscheduled movement had one thing in common. The operator ID field had been empty, consistent in its absence, even as everything else stayed clean. That was the one stable detail I could rely on. The one part of the record that didn't try to correct itself or blend into the rest of the system. I scrolled back to the most recent entry again, not expecting anything different, just confirming what I had already seen. That was when I noticed the change. Gate 2, 3:42 a.m., adjusted by a small increment. The operator ID field wasn't blank anymore. It showed my name. For a second, I thought I had misread it. The rest of the line looked the same as before. Clean formatting, correct timestamp, movement range that matched what the system had reported. Only that one field had changed. I leaned closer to the screen, reading it again, slower this time, making sure the letters didn't shift into something else if I looked at them differently. They didn't. It was my login, exactly the way it appeared on every entry I had actually made earlier in the shift. Same spacing, same capitalization, no difference in how the system displayed it. I hadn't touched the panel. I hadn't confirmed any input. I had been outside when the last movement happened. There was no point in the timeline where I could have triggered that action without knowing it. I checked the previous entries next, moving backward through the log to see if the same change had been applied to anything else. Gate 5, 2:49 a.m., still blank. Gate 3, 3:07 a.m., blank. Gate 7, 3:18 a.m., blank. Then I moved forward again to the latest one, and my name was still there, sitting in place like it had been written at the same time as the rest of the entry. I refreshed the screen once, then again, watching for any flicker or delay that might suggest the system was updating fields after the fact. Nothing shifted. The line stayed stable. I opened the detailed view for that entry, pulling up the expanded record that showed every parameter associated with the movement. Everything matched a normal command. Input confirmed, movement executed, log completed. The only part missing was the moment where I actually made that decision. I stepped back from the terminal and looked at the panel again, not because I expected it to explain anything, but because I needed to see if the physical controls had changed in a way that I hadn't noticed. Every switch was still in neutral. None of them had been moved into a position that would indicate manual input. There was no partial engagement, no sign that something had been triggered and returned. The panel looked the way it always did, when nothing was being adjusted. I walked over to the door and looked out toward the spillway again, even though I had just been out there minutes earlier. The gates held their positions. The water moved within range. Nothing in the physical environment suggested that a human operator had intervened. The only place that intervention existed was in the log, and it had my name attached to it. I went back to the terminal and placed my hand on the desk beside the keyboard, steadying myself more out of habit than anything else. If the system had started assigning my name to actions I hadn't taken, then the boundary I had been relying on was gone. Up until now, I could at least separate what I had done from what the system had done on its own. That separation had been the only thing keeping the situation contained. Now, it was starting to overlap. I opened a new entry and began writing a note in the discrepancy section, documenting exactly what I was seeing, making sure to state clearly that I had not initiated the movement tied to my ID. Before I finished the sentence, another line appeared at the top of the log. Gate 6, 3:51 a.m. movement recorded. Operator ID, Daniel Mercer. I didn't finish the note after that second entry appeared with my name on it. I left the cursor where it was and moved my hand away from the keyboard, like contact with it might connect me to whatever was writing those lines. Gate 6, 3:51 a.m. Small adjustment. My operator ID attached the same way it would have been if I had confirmed the input myself. The structure of the entry was identical to every legitimate action I had taken earlier in the shift, down to the timing between confirmation and execution. I hadn't touched the panel. I hadn't entered anything into the system. I checked the switches again anyway, one by one, making sure none of them had been moved without me noticing. They were all still in neutral. That didn't change the fact that the system had just recorded me as the source of a command I never gave. I stepped back from both the panel and the terminal after that, putting as much distance between myself and the controls as the room allowed, without leaving it entirely. If the system was now writing my name into the log, I needed to remove any chance that my presence was being interpreted as input. I stood near the back wall and watched the panel from there, keeping my hands at my sides and my body clear of the desk. The indicators held steady for a few minutes, long enough that I started to track the time again in my head, waiting for the next adjustment the same way I had earlier in the shift. At 3:58 a.m., Gate 4 lifted by a narrow increment, smooth and controlled, matching the pattern of earlier corrections. I didn't move. I didn't even shift my stance. The system completed the adjustment without me. When I went to the terminal this time, I already knew what I was going to see, but I still checked it slowly, reading each part of the entry like I needed to confirm that it hadn't changed format again. Gate 4, 3:58 a.m. Movement recorded cleanly. No errors, no flags. Operator ID, Daniel Mercer. My name again, placed exactly where it should have been if I had initiated the command. I opened the detailed view and looked at the confirmation field, the part of the record that should only exist if an operator had completed the input sequence. It showed a valid confirmation tied to my login session with a timestamp that fell exactly in line with the movement. There was no gap in the process, no missing step the system had tried to hide. It wasn't leaving things out anymore. It was completing them. I stopped looking for a way to separate myself from the system after that. The distinction I had been relying on was gone, replaced by something that treated my presence as enough to justify a full sequence of actions. I walked over to the panel again, not to use it, but to see if interacting with it physically would change anything about how the system responded. I rested my hand on the edge without touching any switches and waited. Nothing happened right away. The indicators stayed in place, the downstream level held steady, and the room felt the same as it had for most of the night. Then, without any input from me, Gate 1 lowered slightly, reversing a small portion of the earlier adjustments. I pulled my hand back immediately, but the movement continued to completion as if it had already been decided. I didn't check the terminal immediately after that last movement. Instead, I stood there and watched the panel, taking in all 8 indicators at once, trying to see the system the way it would look to someone who trusted it completely. The positions made sense. The adjustments balanced each other. The overall flow remained controlled within safe limits. There was no visible sign that anything had gone wrong, no alarm, no mismatch that would force an operator to intervene. When I finally turned to the terminal, the entry was already waiting. Gate 1, 4:03 a.m. Movement recorded. Operator ID Daniel Mercer. I hadn't touched the controls. I hadn't confirmed anything. Still, the system had completed the action and assigned it to me, as if my role in the process no longer required participation to be recorded. By the time the clock moved past 4:10 a.m., I understood that nothing I had done during the night had changed the direction the system was moving in. Standing close to the panel, stepping back from it, watching the indicators, ignoring them, none of it altered how the gates adjusted or how the logs filled in afterward. The only thing left that still felt like a choice was whether I continued to behave like I was the one responsible for it. I went back to the desk slowly and pulled up a blank incident report, the same form I would have used if something had failed in a way that required documentation. The cursor blinked at the top of the page. waiting for input that would turn the shift into something explainable. I rested my hands on the keyboard, then typed one word into the report field, slow enough to feel each key press register. Refused. I didn't submit it. I left the report open and stepped away from the desk again, putting a few feet of space between myself and anything that could be interpreted as input. The room settled into a steady quiet that didn't feel like the absence of activity, but like a system maintaining itself without needing attention. The panel lights held steady for a few minutes, long enough that I stopped expecting an immediate response to what I had typed. Then, at 4:17 a.m., Gate 3 lifted by a narrow increment, a clean, controlled movement that followed the same pattern as the earlier adjustments. I didn't move toward the panel. I didn't check the terminal right away. I just watched the indicator reach its position and hold there, knowing the entry would already exist by the time I chose to look at it. The system didn't need confirmation anymore. It completed its own sequence. When I did step back to the terminal, the log looked exactly the way it had for the last hour. Gate 3, 4:17 a.m. Movement recorded. Operator ID, Daniel Mercer. No delay, no missing fields, no indication that anything about the process had changed from the system's perspective. I scrolled back through the earlier entries again, slower this time, watching the transition in the record itself. At the start of the shift, the operator field had been empty when the gates moved. Then it had filled in once. Then it had started appearing regularly. Now it was part of every entry, consistent and complete, as if the system had corrected whatever it had been missing earlier, and no longer needed to leave that space blank. The record didn't show a problem resolving. It showed a system settling into a version of itself that included me. I turned away from the terminal and faced the back wall again, testing the only thing I hadn't fully removed yet, my attention. If the system was aligning with what I would have done, then taking that away should have changed something in how it behaved. I stood there without looking at the panel, counting out the seconds in my head without tying them to any visible change. The sound of the water shifted first, a subtle redistribution of pressure that carried through the structure before any movement showed on the board. I turned back. Gate 6 had lifted slightly, the indicator already settling into position. I hadn't watched it happen. I hadn't anticipated it. Still, it had adjusted in a way that kept everything within range. The system didn't need me to think through the correction anymore. It didn't need me to see it. I went back to the terminal and looked at the report I had left open. The word was still there, sitting alone in the field where I would normally explain what had gone wrong and how it had been handled. Refused. It didn't connect to anything else on the screen. It wasn't tied to a log entry. It didn't appear in the system history. It was just a line of text I had entered without completing the process. I hovered over the submit option for a few seconds, then moved the cursor away and left the form open. There wasn't a category for what was happening, and there wasn't a way to file it without turning it into something the system would treat as resolved. Behind me, the panel adjusted again. Another small movement I didn't turn to watch. The system continued without waiting for me to decide what to call it. I closed the incident form without submitting it and left the terminal on the main log view, the same way it had been for most of the night. There was no version of the report that would make sense of what the system was doing, and leaving it incomplete felt closer to the truth than forcing it into a format that assumed something had gone wrong. I stepped back again and watched the panel without trying to predict anything, letting the system run on its own terms. At 4:31 a.m., 2 gates adjusted within the same minute, something the training specifically warned against during manual operation because of how easily it could push the flow out of balance if the timing was off. Gate 2 lowered slightly, while Gate 5 lifted by a matching amount. The 2 movements offset just enough to redistribute the pressure without creating a spike downstream. I didn't move. The system completed both adjustments cleanly. When I checked the terminal, the entries were already there, 2 lines sitting one after the other as if they had been entered as part of a single coordinated action. Gate 2, 4:31 a.m. Adjustment recorded. Gate 5, 4:31 a.m. Adjustment recorded. Both carried my operator ID, both formatted correctly, both confirmed in a way that matched a complete input sequence. I opened the detailed view for each one, looking for any difference in how the system had processed them compared to the entries I had actually made earlier in the night. There wasn't one. The confirmation fields were filled, the timing between input and execution was consistent, and the session ID tied back to my login without any interruption. The system wasn't approximating my actions anymore. It was completing them in full without me touching anything. At 4:42 a.m., the sequence changed again in a way that made the rest of the night feel like it had been building toward it. A new line appeared at the top of the log before anything moved on the panel. Gate 7, adjustment recorded, timestamp active, operator ID already filled in. I stood there looking at it for a second, then turned to the panel and watched the indicator for that gate. It hadn't moved yet. 5 seconds passed, then 6. Long enough that I could feel the gap between the record and the action as something real, instead of something I had inferred earlier. Then the indicator lifted, smooth and controlled, settling into the position that had already been written into the log. I looked back at the screen. The timestamp hadn't changed. The entry had been recorded before the movement took place. By the time the sky started to lighten beyond the tree line, the system had settled into a pattern that didn't depend on sequence at all. Sometimes the panel moved first. Sometimes the log appeared first. Sometimes the water shifted before either one. It didn't matter which part I watched or in what order I tried to follow it. The result stayed the same. Every gate position made sense in relation to the others. Every level reading stayed within limits that would pass inspection without question. The entire station looked like it had been monitored correctly for the duration of the shift. I stood near the door and watched the spillway through the glass, not tracking individual changes anymore, just taking in the system as a whole. If someone had walked in and asked me whether anything needed to be corrected, I would have had to say no, based on everything I could measure. At 5:02 a.m., a final entry appeared at the top of the log without any corresponding change on the panel or in the water. I stepped over and read it slowly, making sure I didn't miss anything this time. Gate 8, scheduled adjustment, 10:14 p.m. the following night. Movement not yet executed. Operator ID, Daniel Mercer. I looked at the panel, then back at the screen, waiting for something to shift and confirm it was just another sequence I didn't understand yet. Nothing moved. The system held steady, as if the next action had already been accounted for and didn't require immediate confirmation. When the day operator's truck pulled into the lot outside, I logged out of the terminal, stepped away from the panel, and left the station the way I found it. The gates stayed within range behind me. The log stayed complete. My name stayed on the next command. When the city sleeps, it notices who doesn't.